This is the Fantoid Podcast from fantasyomatic.com.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. I am Chris Anthony from fantasyomatic.com, and I really appreciate you putting the Fantoid mini-pod in your ears today. I'm only going to need a few minutes of your time, so let's get at it. And in this episode, we're going to tackle one of my favorite topics. It's the myth of fantasy points against, specifically Fantasyomatic's ratings versus fantasy points against. Now, fantasy football success is really all about two things: having really good players and favorable matchups. It's really taking great players and giving them the least path of resistance to success. Now, ideally, each week you'd want to play a good player who's playing against a bad defense. But a, air quotes, good player and an, air quotes, bad defense may not always be as easily identifiable as you think. So here at Fantasyomatic, we calculate true player ratings and true matchup strength. However, all the most popular sites, and I mean all of them, ESPN, CBS, NFL, Yahoo, just pick whatever one you're using, they all use a calculation that's known as fantasy points against, otherwise known as FPA. And they use that to rank all the NFL defenses. What FPA does is it simply looks across the league and adds up how many fantasy points each defense gives up to each position. Then those defenses are sorted, ranked by the position from best to worst, just according to how many points they give up. So the defense that gives up the most points to quarterbacks, for example, would be ranked last and would appear to be the best matchup for you to start your quarterbacks against. And this would, of course, make you think that you should always start your players against this defense. However, I want you to look at it a different way. So what if that defense has only played Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, Russell Wilson? So are they really the worst defense against quarterbacks? Probably not. They just happen to play some extremely good quarterbacks. So should you expect a good game if you start a marginally good quarterback against that same defense? Actually, no. So this is where the true flaw of fantasy points against is highlighted. The amount of points a defense have given up means a lot, but the algorithm that we use here provides a calibration for opponent quality, which is really how you should be judging a defense. So let's think about it for a second. Let's say we've got defense A, and they gave up 20 fantasy points to Patrick Mahomes. And then there's defense B, who gave up 18 fantasy points to, let's say, Mitch Trubisky. So which of those defenses is better against quarterbacks? Well, according to fantasy points against, defense B is actually a tougher matchup for fantasy quarterbacks because they gave up less points. That's the whole principle behind fantasy points against. But Mahomes is one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL, and Mitch Trubisky is, well, a future car salesman. So really, defense A actually had the better game since they faced a much better quarterback but only gave up 2 more points. Therefore, defense B, who gave up only 18 points, is actually the easier matchup for fantasy quarterbacks. It's the opposite of what FPA tells you. So if you continue to look at the quality of the quarterbacks that a defense faces all season, the total fantasy points against begins to mean less and less when separated from the quarterbacks who put up those points. So to truly get the full picture of how good a defense is against a position, you absolutely need to look at both the amount of points allowed and the quality of the players that defense has faced.
2 minutes.
Then, on the other side, the Fantasyomatic ratings don't just consider the value of a player to be the amount of fantasy points they scored, but rather the amount of fantasy points they scored weighted against the quality of their opponents. So let's look at this one. Let's say you have quarterback A, and he averages 20 points a game. Okay? Quarterback B averages 15 points a game. So based on the metrics that every other site uses, you'd likely want to play the player who averages more points per game, right? However, what if you knew that quarterback A faced defenses that allow normally 25 points a game or more, then quarterback B was actually facing defenses thus far this season that only allow 10 points a game or more? Now suddenly, quarterback B, that's the one who averages only 15 points a game, is actually the best bet to score more fantasy points on any given week. So without exception, the rest of the fantasy industry ranks players solely on fantasy points scored. The Fantasyomatic system takes an even more accurate look at their ability to score and comes up with this rating system that we use to rank players, thus determining their value compared to other players. So now that you have a true strength of opposing defenses and a true player scoring potential, you can combine those two concepts, and then you have a true matchup value to evaluate each week and for the rest of a given season. So if fantasy football is indeed only about the matchups, then you need to have the most accurate matchup rating you can find in order to give yourself the best chance to win. In short, fantasyomatic reflects a player's ability to outperform difficult fantasy matchups, while also the ability to take advantage of easy matchups. You're going to want a roster full of those guys. So you're going to want to go with a system that provides greater matchup accuracy than the typical fantasy points against ratings. Now, the good part about fantasy points against ratings is that they're universally adopted everywhere. That means all the other people in your league, they're all using FPA. Great. Let them go follow that herd and use all that dirty, inaccurate data while you're fine-tuning your resources and using the stuff that matters. So the season is here. Please subscribe. Give us a review. We know that you don't want to tell anyone in your league about your secret weapons, but if you have friends in other leagues, please pass on the pod or turn them on to the website. We really appreciate it. So until next time, I'm Chris Anthony, and thanks for listening to the Fantoid Podcast.